So in today's video, I want to share all the high ticket sales lies that I actually believed in. And you probably believe in these lies too, because the truth is there's a lot of stuff that the high ticket sales gurus that will tell you that simply isn't true. And specifically, I want to dispel all the myths that they talk about because I've actually used this myself. If you're wondering who's this kind of Kevin Wynn looking bald Asian guy, I'm actually Ali Abdaal's fractional head of sales. Funny enough, it was all this BS stuff that helped me generate over 150k in revenue for Ali Abdaal in just 2 to 3 weeks of high ticket sales. So everything that I'm going to talk about today are the things that I not only use to sell high ticket offers, but are the things that I use to build my offers myself, and I sold those too as well. Oh yeah, and did I mention I'm pretty much consolidating all 6 years of my experience in high ticket sales in this one video. I have handwritten notes and my laptop over there to look at notes, so if my eyes wander, don't be too distracted by it. All right, let's get into the video. You don't need more skill to close higher ticket deals. So I think there's a misconception that you need a lot more skill to close higher ticket deals. And this simply isn't true. When I look back at my kind of high ticket sales career, I realize it takes the same amount of skill and relatively the same amount of effort to close a $300 deal versus a $30,000 deal. There's pretty much no difference at all. And so back when I was a baby closer, I was so terrified of closing deals and asking for the commitment and stuff. And I remember back in the day, I would just stutter. And if you follow my story, then you kind of know I used to I was so close to getting fired. Technically not fired because I wasn't employed. I was a contractor, but I was going to get my contract terminated. So I basically started doing this thing that I personally call inbound setting. This works really well when you have a high volume of calls, you have top performers on a team, and they need to take more qualified calls. So what I did was I would just kind of screen the calls. So I would do all the discovery calls and screen the qualified leads for the closer. That went really, really well for me. That saved my ass. And then I was like, okay, I'm surviving. What do I do now? How do I advance my skills? Because yes, you can make pretty decent money just doing this, but I wanted to get better at the art of sales. But I think a lot of times we think selling is convincing, persuading you to buy something. In reality, it's just connecting someone's problem to a potential solution. And then it's really up to the buyer whether they want to do it or not. And it's not only just a logic thing, it's an emotional thing. And at the time, I just really wasn't good at it. My question asking and my ability to connect the dots wasn't really there. And so back to the story. So basically, if someone wasn't financially qualified, we wouldn't force them into the high ticket. But if they still had that problem and they really want to solve it, I would offer this kind of low ticket offer. You can kind of look at it as a phase engagement. It's kind of a baby step toward the larger problem. I remember this moment where my closer, the person I was working with, the experienced high ticket salesperson, he was like, hey, Kevin, you should actually try selling these offers. And so I started doing it. And I remember kind of jumping on the phone and I'm like, oh my God, I'm so nervous because I'm going to try closing this deal for the first time, right? And the deal was actually only $300, which is crazy because honestly, that's an impulse buy, right? Most people, they don't even flinch at that type of payment. But I remember it taking a whole 90 minutes. It took an insane amount of time. And it wasn't because I was convincing. It was because I was just really scared of the money conversation. I was scared of the commitment and stuff. And I just wasn't that skilled. As you get more skilled, you get more nuance with your question asking. The process shortens drastically. But when I look at where I am right now and where I was back then, what is the major difference between the skill now and before? Well, to be honest, it's relatively the same process as I did before. It's relatively the same questions. So what's the difference? Why does it feel so much harder? In my mind, there's 3 things, right? So with higher ticket deals, we kind of psych ourselves out. We start projecting our own beliefs with money on a call. So if we believe something is really expensive, then we start signaling to that other person that this is really, really expensive too. The second thing is there is more from the logistical issues, right? So when you're moving large amounts of money, you might have to break it up on several different cards. You might have to get funding. There's a lot of different things. Think about the complexity of buying a stick of gum or Chipotle bowl, right? You just swipe your card. But when you're buying real estate, there's a whole escrow process and all this other stuff too. So with higher ticket deals, there's a slight logistical issue and higher chance that the logistics might not work out. And then number 3 It's kind of like a lead volume type of thing. So with higher ticket deals, you might have less lead volume because you're targeting a smaller part of the market. And so if you're getting a lot less lead volume because it's a higher ticket, chances are you might feel more pressure to close every single deal that comes your way. It builds this like scarcity mindset. And I talk a lot about this in my free course too. But I want you to notice like the 3 situations I mentioned. Like most of these are kind of internal situations. I mean, the logistics stuff is easy because, okay, you can easily figure out how to do like a bank wire. You can easily break up multiple payments on a credit card or create customized invoices, right? That's the easy stuff, right? But the other 2 are more psychology based. You just need to be very self-aware and notice what is going on. Notice when we are psyching ourselves out. And it doesn't help when you say like, hey, don't be nervous when you're talking about money. Hey, don't have the scarcity mindset. I feel like that don't mentality doesn't really help. It's kind of like if you're really nervous, you tell someone don't be nervous and they get even more nervous, right? But something to remember is that we are not our target market. We are not in that person's situation. And we also have to respect everybody else's like unique decision-making process, right? Just because I make a decision in a certain way doesn't mean someone else will too. And what I've realized since kind of adopting this mindset is that I realized that it's actually easier to close higher ticket clients because premium clients tend to understand the nuance. If it's like more a business op or business consulting type of package, then premium clients understand the importance of investing into their business or into personal development, right? Versus like people who are really strapped for cash. And it's not their fault either. There's a saying in sales like buyers are liars and people will ghost you and stuff. And I realized a lot of that friction a lot of times comes when the investment is a large percentage of their annual revenue or whatever, or income, right? For example, asking someone to invest like $10,000 when they only make $50,000 per year, it's quite a lot. It's 20% of their income, right? But think about someone who's making $1 million per year. They probably don't care about like that 1%, that $10,000, which is 1%. At least that's like what I hope to assume. And what I realized is usually that desperation hits around like if it's more than 10% of their whole income. So that's something I typically screen for. At least have conversations about it. We'll talk about that later. But what I realized is even when that person invests a large percentage of their income or revenue, what I noticed, it actually creates this like kind of savior process, like, oh, you're the only one that can help me. And it creates this like desperation, which is like, honestly, that's the worst type of engagement, even from like the fulfillment point of view. It feels like you're playing Captain Save-A-Ho, and it's very, very heavy, and like it's not a good thing to do, especially if you are on a business op. They call it business op because it's like business opportunity, like you're trying to start up a business and stuff. Business is already hard, and the last thing you need to do is like put more pressure sometimes. At least that's my belief. Some people will argue differently. So the other thing I think is BS is like when gurus say price is only objection when there's no perceived value. So I think this is total BS. So back in the day, I used to have a sales manager. He was like the manager of like ClickFunnels and stuff at one point, but then left. And he knew everyone in the ClickFunnels community. By the way, I'm not a big fan of the ClickFunnels community. If you use ClickFunnels, that's all good, man. Like no hate. It attracts this like lower frequency type of thing. And I remember being on these meetings in the morning. We used to meet every single day. Another thing I hate are daily sales meetings, because I feel like, do you really need a group huddle every single day just to motivate people? Chances are that's a skill thing or an internal problem. But anyways, he used to say things like, hey, you new closers are soft. Back in the day, we used to spend 2+ hours overcoming objections and stuff. I'm really good friends with him, by the way, but in my mind, I was like, that's like not only stupid, but really ineffective and inefficient, because every single call that I go through, there's typical red flags. If someone has an additional partner, or if their timeline is really far in the future, or they just seem like they don't have a lot of cash or money is on their mind, like their ROI is coming up all the time, that's usually a sign for red flags for potential objection in the future, right? And don't get me wrong, I really respect this guy. He really helped me during my closing journey, and even recently too, as I've just been structuring my offers, but it's just like a difference in viewpoints, right? And so the best analogy I can think of is like when your girlfriend is actually mad at you. Like if you've been in a relationship, we always know like she's like clearly pissed off and you ask like, hey, what's wrong? And she's like, nothing. That tonality tells you everything. But then you're just like, okay, I'm just gonna go on without my day, and she gets even more mad at you, right? And the tension escalates and it gets worse and worse and worse. And in my mind, it's doing the same thing by pretending nothing wrong. That's like kind of idiotic, right? We don't want to do the same thing with sales. And usually these things are the things I said earlier. They're like the money, the time, the decision makers and stuff, and not understanding how they make their decisions in the business. So you might say things like this. This is how I do it. Not saying that you should do it this way, but I use a lot of therapist language, right? So with time, I like to say, hey, I like to be mindful of your situation or time frame. If you were to start a solution like this, when would you consider starting? Right? It's very unassumptive, by the way. I'm not saying, hey, if you were to start this, when are you going to start? Right? Like that is an example of assumptive type of thing. With money, I like to be like, hey, I like to be mindful of your finances or financial situation. The minimum to work with us is X amount of dollars. Is that a number that you can possibly work with, right? Notice I mentioned a few things, possibly, and like I'm not being assumptive, right? Another thing I do for money too is like, hey, I like to be mindful of your financial situation. Typically clients pay us on the high end X amount of dollars and Y amount on the lower end. Where in this range do you kind of fit, if at all? Right? So I give them way out, and if it's totally out of range, like that's totally cool. I don't continue pitching or presentations part, right? There's no point of that. I want to talk about the red flags up front. So for decision makers or decision making, I use two different things, right? This is more B2C, but like I'll be like, hey, I like to be mindful of your decision making process. Is there anybody else that you feel like should be in the know or part of this conversation? What would some of their concerns be? How do you guys go about making decisions? That's B2C. For B2B, I'll use words like, hey, I want to be mindful of your vendor selection process. Can you walk me through a bit about your vendor selection process and how you go about making decisions? Do you have a discretionary spend? Things like that, right? These are called qualification questions. But by doing this like right before your presentation, it just saves all this headache because you know where the conversation is going to go. And you're pre-handling, I don't even like the word pre-handling like objections, but you're talking about the red flags up front that might potentially kill a deal. Honestly, you'll find out whether it was a deal or not with these questions. A final thing too, like I think a lot of old school salespeople will be like, but Kevin, you can convince them to do OPM, other people's money or other people's moms, and ask people's moms for money, right? Sure, you could, but I also like to think like, okay, I used to do that and I've seen people kind of do that. Like, could you technically put everything on a credit card? Sure. And even better, could you even make it even sweeter and get a 0% APR card? Sure. But the thing I've seen is like when people are constantly stretching themselves thin financially, these offers tend to not last for a long time. I'm not saying all offers, but I tend to notice like this is where majority of the bad reviews come from. This is where majority of the headache comes from for fulfillment. And even though you kind of collect it, is it really worth that? And that's up to every single owner, right? For me personally, I take the stance that I don't want to waste time or even risk that for people who are unqualified for the offer, right? In my opinion, yes, just because they have the ability doesn't mean that they're a qualified person for that. Call me crazy. I'm probably leaving money on the table just with that. But I also think about this concept of clean energy when it comes to business too. Even though I'm not Muslim or anything like that, I think in the Islamic texts, like the whole concept of riba being haram or forbidden, which is riba is interest, by the way, is actually really, really smart. And that's something that I personally choose not to do in my businesses or anything like that either. So another thing that a lot of high ticket sales people will tell you that I believe is BS is like create scarcity and urgency through your sales call, right? And I don't know how I feel about this because I really think urgency and that scarcity should be built into the offer, right? Should be pre-communicated through the sales page. There's like the ethical side and the unethical, shady, ClickFunnels guru type of stuff, right? As I look through my career of high ticket sales, I realize that high ticket sales people are like really good at gaslighting people. Like they're super, super good. And I remember like, man, there's this other sales manager. I'm also really cool with him. him. He almost fired me, but like we're super cool. And then I remember one time he was like, hey, I'm gonna take this actual sales call like right on the spot and see what happens, right? And then I remember he's getting to the presentation and he'd be like, oh yeah, like, and it's your lucky day. Today we have the fast action taking discount where we reward action takers. Instead of 5,800, it's 5,000. But here's the truth. I think consumers these days are, maybe that worked like 10, 20 years ago, but I think consumers these days are smarter than ever. Most people know that that's all BS, right? And that stated price is actually the real normal price every single time. And so I think consumers aren't that dumb. With things like Reddit, with things like all these forums, people actually talk, and you can't expect people not to talk. And I know there's some businesses that focus a lot of their attention taking down reviews and stuff, paying people off. But in my mind, it's like, why focus all that energy on that when you could just prevent it and just provide really good service and deliver what you're going to do anyways, and actually allocate those resources toward that too, right? I know that's an idealistic type of approach, but that's something I think about a lot of the time, right? And here's another thing about like salespeople. Like, people already don't trust salespeople. I don't even like salespeople. Alex Hormozy's team cold called me, and the guy was so rude, by the way. And I'm like, oh man. So people are already looking. There's something called confirmation bias, where we look for things that confirm our existing beliefs. And when you try to do some BS scarcity type of thing, it just confirms that they can't trust you. So how do you create urgency in the offer? Like, what do you do instead? In my mind, there's a few ways. Like, one, it's like during the discovery call, where it's like you discover a burning problem with a real consequence, right? The word create emotion, or buying is an emotional type of thing, is like honestly very, very overused. I think it's like, what does that mean? Because like there's happy emotions, there's sad emotions, there's all that sort of stuff. But I think like something like painful, like super, super painful. Like, a lot of my questions a lot of times will be like, if everything sounds good, I'm just like, hey, it sounds like everything is going well, so why even consider something like this, right? And it's a legit question. I'm not trying to like gaslight them or like get them to think a different way. It's because it is true. Like, everything that they stated seems pretty good, and so would it make sense to invest in something like this, right? At least that's my thought process. The basis behind everything I do is just really trying to understand. So I usually, like, when people are talking about their situation, I'm not only looking for problems, but I'm also like trying to understand the real intent behind this. So when they're like, yeah, like we want more views, I'm like, okay, so what's the real reason behind getting more views? By doing that, what are you hoping to accomplish with that, right? Going a lot deeper. So that's one. The second thing I think is really ethical is using capacity-based scarcity. You have X amount of slots, you can take on X amount of clients. Every business has a fulfillment capacity, and I believe that is very, very ethical. I don't think there's anything shady about that, unless you're like 7 slots left and then you like onboard like 200 people and the slots never go down. I think that's unethical. I think the thing about this is like, chances are you can't take 1,000 clients tomorrow unless you're onboarding and your capacity is above the roof, right? That's how I know a really legit offer is like, they're always hyper aware of their capacity. And then I think the last thing is aiming to close a deadline. And I think these cohort models of offers really make sense. There's a natural like starting and closing date. What I like about this is like, we're going to do this with or without you. And it's that with or without you energy is just so magnetic. I've seen it happen in the dating world, right? And I've also seen it happen in the offer world, like what we're talking about right now. Daniel Priestley talks about it. I love this energy, and I try to embody this energy a lot of times and stuff too. So the language I typically use is like, hey, so we're actually aiming to onboard new clients by this week / next week, but I also want to be mindful of your situation. If you were to do a solution like this, what's your ideal timeline? Right? It's like a very permission-based type of thing. Like, these are the most ethical ways to do it. It's not like fast action taking discount people talk about. Like, it just gives off a strong sales vibe. These are the legit ways, and I think it's usually a problem with the offer if there's not enough scarcity in the conversation too. To be honest, there's probably more legit and ethical ways to do things, but these are ways that I find that kind of drive a decision without forcing people to make a decision there. It's allowing people space, and it's also setting proper boundaries. That's a huge thing. It's like setting proper resentment-free boundaries about what we're going to do, what we're planning, and being able to communicate that consistent thing from the sales page to the sales call and to the final decision. Let's move on to the next thing. Always be closing comes off really desperate. I hate this word of always be closing, like ABC, always be closing, right? You know what it feels like? It feels like my dating life back in the day. So back in college, I would have a crush on a girl and try to play Captain Save-A-Ho to win her over. It's like the typical like nice guy stuff, but it never freaking worked, right? My name in college was Friendzone, which was the worst. And after a while, I got burned so many times that I was like, I'm gonna just be super avoidant. I'm not gonna go for any relationships. Girls don't like me, whatever, right? And that's when actually girls started like showing interest or liking me at parties and stuff like that too. And by the way, I'm not telling you be a to your future girlfriends or your future leads, but the truth is, like, the deal should feel like two partners coming to a table. It should not feel like, oh, I'm Captain Save-A-Ho here to save you. Again, it should have this with or without you energy. Like, I try not to be a salesperson. I try to be a trusted advisor. On a call, I try to be very, very conscious or very curious about people's situation, their problems, what they've considered, and of course, like, a good relationship, like on a date, like, you want to bring up like the red flags too if you notice any things, right? Using things like labeling and all these different skill sets I teach in my free course, by the way. And a lot of times too, I'll anticipate things on their end too. Like, there's these small signs that people are either going through a lot of financial trouble or anything like that, and you just want to bring that up. What I've kind of learned throughout this process is that self-awareness is pretty sexy, right? Like, when someone is self-aware, like, it just builds this, oh, like, this guy, like, he kind of empathizes with me in a very implicit way. And so something I've had to learn over the last few years is not to friend zone my way into a deal every single time, right? You want to have this with or without you energy and project that out. I want to say I do my best to not get too attached and to always ground myself, like, with that energy. And it's something that you can't really fake. You can tell yourself, like, be confident in the mirror all the time. But the truth is just like, if you don't feel confident, you're not going to be confident, right? But the truth is, looking in the mirror and saying, hey, be confident for like 20 minutes isn't really going to help you, right? It has to naturally come off, and you need to believe it. It's very, very true. And that's why they have like this saying, like, be, do, have, or whatever, like, being this person who doesn't need the business. Like, I think for all my clients, I rather avoid a resentful relationship with a nightmare client than actually take on this ideal client and get a commission or get paid out for that. It's not worth it. There's also this other saying in high ticket sales where they're like, hey, money loves speed, right? But what they don't tell you is, like, money also hates desperation. Women actually hate like desperation a lot of time too. I'm very guilty of it. And that's the thing. You don't need to close everyone, and nor should you. It is your job. Like, that's why I bake into all my high ticket sales engagements to not be focused so much on closing, but to be qualifying the right people into the offer or solution, representing or selling, right? I think that should be a huge change in the high ticket sales world. So set boundaries, respect yourself. So let's get into the next BS thing. Assume the sale. I freaking hate this. There's this concept of commanding the sale or assuming the sale. This is when you assume someone's gonna buy, someone's gonna move forward. Because honestly, in my opinion, this is a bad idea because it adds unnecessary like sales pressure to the deal, right? Sales pressure is that, hey, you're applying pressure where it's like fight, flight, or freeze. So flight is like when they ghost you, right? Fight is like when they attack you or argue with you. And freeze is when they're just like, I need to think about it, right? That's how it looks like in sales in particular. But as soon as you kind of apply this external pressure, you suddenly break rapport and trust, because suddenly, like in the trusted advisor book, you're no longer looking out for their interests, you're looking out for your own, and they can feel this, right? There's also this funny term that Jeremy Miner has where they call commission breath. I think this is so hilarious. It's the same vibe as if someone is assuming that they're going to sleep with you, right? An example of this in sales, by the way, is kind of like an assumptive close. So like, hey, so let's get started. We can either do this today or tomorrow or get started Friday. What works best for you? But what they don't realize is, like, in their head, they're like, what the I never said I wanted to do this. And at that point, it feels like the trust and rapport, all that work that you did up front, it's gone. because you're looking out for your own check rather than looking out for their best interests. And so at the end of the day, like, I really try my best to like respect people's autonomy to make decisions, right? And so like, this is how I usually ask for like a sale and stuff like that. It varies based off the conversation, if I'm feeling nervous, honestly, or if I'm not. Usually I'll say like, hey, you know, so really, if we were to do this, we would do like XYZ. We're aiming to start on blah, blah, blah. Want to be mindful of your timeline, your decision making. We could do that, but what do you feel like would be best for you? How would you like the next steps to look like, right? Something like that. What I like about this open approach is that it opens up a two-way conversation, not a command. No one likes being told what to do because even as kids, we freaking hated it too, right? Another thing that the gurus tell you about is like the 30K months. I want to say, by the way, the 30K months are definitely possible, but there's one caveat that no one talks about. It might not always be consistent, especially if you're performance-based. Let me explain. You're performance-based, you're commission-based. Your revenue is based on the lead flow, right? How many leads you get per week, how many sales calls per week. And especially if you're on organic or if the lead cost jumps up suddenly, your lead flow might not look the same. So an example of this is like last month I had about 50 calls booked. Not all of them showed up, by the way, but that's like the total calls booked. I closed about 98,681 in just 2 weeks. And so if I made 10% conservatively, you can do the math. That's like 98,000, right? Not including future deals and all that. And that meant I was generating about like roughly $2,000 of revenue per lead. That sounds great, right? Which is kind of like roughly every single call I was having, I pretty much was making $200 every single time I picked up the phone, assuming it's a 10%. 10% is just easy for these numbers, right? That sounds really great, right? But then the next month, I only had 12 bookings because we weren't promoting as much and all that sort of stuff. And since I'm only contracted for inbound services, I don't really have control over the lead flow regardless of my skills. And if you want to argue that, hey, you should do outbound contacting and all that sort of stuff, that is a different scope of work, by the way, and you should charge more. Just FYI. Because if you're a inbound closer, high ticket sales person, most of the times the arrangement is the client to bring in leads, not you, because your scope of work is just the inbound leads. At the end of the day, it'll work out if you have a really great client because they're probably really responsible with their lead flow and they want to make more money. But with experienced people like myself who have been in the game for a little bit now, that's why I always tell people to factor in a base to kind of build this contingency into your business, right? Because you have to look at yourself as a business. You are a contractor, so technically you are a business. It does like three things. One, it retains you for being on the offer because if you're not making money, then you're going to jump, right? And the client probably doesn't want that either. Two, it helps you not become desperate. It should cover your living expenses. If you have one client, it should cover a majority of your living expenses, like that bottom number, so that you don't become desperate and have that commission breath. And the third thing is it incentivizes the client to drive more leads, right? What I realized, if you're performance only, there really is no incentive for them to drive more leads sometimes, right? When times are slow, because it doesn't cost them. Yes, there's churn, but they'll find another person, right? And so, yeah, like I think you should throw a few thousand for retention services. You can either do a marketing model where it's like, oh, pay this base and a percentage, or you can do like a base or whatever's higher. Depends, up to you. So these are some of the things that I realized, but I wanted to ask you, what are some of the things that you felt like were total BS that were told to you? Help out the new generation in the comments, by the way. Chances are, if you like this video, the YouTube algorithm thinks you'll like this video. I'll talk to you guys later. Stay compassionate, stay authentic, stay rebellious. Peace, my people. Bye.